We're recording now. All right, so this is segregation. This is Jim Crow. The Supreme Court had ruled that separate but equal was okay. Do you remember what Supreme Court ruling that was? Starts with a P. Plessy versus Ferguson. There you go. You need to know that. All right, so Plessy versus Ferguson had made the ruling that separate was equal, okay? And so the water coming out of over here and the water coming out of here are the same water, right? They're piped together, they're the same water, it's the same mineral content, same temperature, same water, right? The service is supposed to be the same. This is the idea here that we're dealing with, is that the service is the same. But what I'm going to tell you right now, that segregation is not about the service. Okay, the water may be the same. The bus, the seat on the bus, the seat in the back is going to reach the bus stop at the same time that the seat in the front, right? It's not about the service. Even if you make the service equal, it can never be equal. Because segregation is about power. It's about power. It's not about the equality of service. It's about power. It's about me being able to tell you where to sit. I tell you what drinking fountain to use. I tell you where to sit. I tell you what door to use. I tell you when you can go to the store. I control you. That's what segregation is all about. And it's also about, the first thing it's about is power. The second thing it's about is identity, right? My identity is superior to your identity, right? I am superior, you are inferior. I'm better than you. Because I'm better than you, I can tell you what to do. That's what segregation is all about. It's not about the service. It's about inflicting psychological harm. It's about inflicting that identity harm on the person. I tell this guy to drink over here because I have the power to tell him that. That's what's really key about segregation. It isn't about, so any argument that isn't about that is an argument that's not being made correctly. It's not an argument, it's either made in bad faith, like somebody who's trying to say, whoa, hold on, I'm not a racist, I just have 2 drinking fountains, right? It's somebody who's making an argument in bad faith, or it's somebody who doesn't understand what's going on. But this is the reality of our country at this time period. Okay, and it's everything, right? It's the laundromat, it's the swimming pool, it's the zoo, it's everything, right? Everything is segregated. Here is the map of segregation in the United States. The red states are totally segregated by law. The blue states have segregation in some stuff. The yellow states have no particular state law, but allow segregation to be managed by the city level, right? So Utah here segregates things by the city. And in the case of like Utah, California, a lot of these West Coast, the segregation is being used against Black people, but mostly they're aiming it at Asians, right? That's mostly what they're aiming it at in those cases. But what we really mostly care about is African-American segregation in the South. Okay. All right. So segregation is going to come to an end 1955. 1955 in the Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board. Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, Brown versus the Board of Education is one of the most important Supreme Court rulings ever. Okay. The basics of the Supreme Court of this ruling is a man named Oliver Brown was living in Topeka, Kansas, and he's Black. He was Black, and he wanted his daughters to go to the school near his house, but the school near his house was white. And so instead of walking 1 block to that school, his daughter has to walk like 13 blocks across train tracks to get to the Black school. And he didn't like that. The NAACP approaches him and sues the school board of Topeka, Kansas. Okay, so Brown is Oliver Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That's the full name. Now, Eric, do you remember what the NAACP is? Right here.
Was this like an organization fighting for African American equality, I guess?
Yeah, they are fighting for African American equality, but what are they specifically fighting for? What in what way? Like, what kind of an organization is this? Is it
Like
like is it like a singing organization? Is it like a fruit growing organization? Is it like building houses? What is it doing?
um, it's in the courts, I guess.
Yeah. So the NAACP is the primary legal organization, or the primary organization providing legal services for African Americans in the country. Okay? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is what it stands for. But nobody ever breaks out the acronym anymore. They all just call it NAACP. Okay. All right. So the NAACP has decided that they want to attack schools. So they want to attack segregation in schools. So they are taking cases like Brown and 12 other families, okay, from 5 states, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Washington, D.C., and Kansas. And they're taking all of these families together and they're fighting it in all these different circuit courts. They know that the Supreme Court can ignore it if it's only in one court, right? But if it's showing up in the 9th and the 6th and the 5th and the 4th circuit, if it's showing up in all those circuit courts, they have to take it. The Supreme Court is just, they're not gonna be able to skip it. Now the NAACP is being headed up by this man in the picture here named Thurgood Marshall, right here, Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall, he is from Baltimore, Maryland, and he grew up in segregated Maryland, segregated Baltimore. So he attended one of only 2 black schools in the whole city of Baltimore. And the black schools sucked. They were terrible, terrible schools, right? Most of the kids grow up poor. They, end up in jail or they end up dead or they end up stuck into these like poor menial jobs where they can never get anywhere, right? Thurgood Marshall was a brilliant man, and he recognized that his education was the key to his future. And what he basically did was use the library to teach himself into law school, right? He basically taught himself everything he needed to learn in order to get into college, in order to get into law school. And so he self-taught his way to law school, basically. And he used a library that he was not allowed to use. Some sympathetic white people were in the library and they would check books out to him, even though it was not open to black people, right? They would just kind of meet him at the back door and give him books. That gives you an idea of like the kind of hurdles that this man has to overcome in order to do this. And I'm going to tell you now, he will become the first black man on the Supreme Court, the first black person on the Supreme Court, the first non-white person on the Supreme Court at all. And that's pretty good, right? So he's the primary lawyer. He's in charge of the NAACP, and he's the lawyer who's arguing Brown v. Board. He argues it to this man right here, Chief Justice Earl Warren. Now, Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed by Eisenhower. Eisenhower is the president at this time. And Eisenhower appoints Warren, and Eisenhower wants segregation to be ended. And he knows that this is the case when he makes Warren the Chief Justice. Chief Justice Warren is a politician. He was the governor of California before he became a justice, before he moved to the Supreme Court. And that matters because once they hear this court case, Warren recognizes that this case is so important that he has to, it's so important that he has to get a unanimous ruling. And so he does what politicians do, and they convince people. So he basically schmoozes his way around all of the other justices to get a unanimous ruling. and the unanimous ruling is in favor of Brown. Segregation must come to an end. Separate can never be equal. This is Warren's quote here. Separate can never be equal. This is his opinion of the court here. We don't need to read all of this, but the opinion of his court here basically is, I'm going to start reading here. To separate them, go ahead and you read it from here, starting with 2.
To separate children in grade and high schools from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, this finding is amply supported by modern authority.
Thurgood Marshall makes the argument. He makes the argument that that the act of separation is an act of psychological damage on children, right? That you are committing a psychological crime, you are committing damage upon them. And Thurgood Marshall has the authority because he can speak about his own life. He can speak about his own cohort of people, all of the people who grew up in his neighborhood that could not get out of those schools and could not get anywhere, right? And precisely because Thurgood Marshall is such an exceptional man that he can look back and say, wow, I really am the only one to get out of that neighborhood, right? And he's like, and look what I had to do to get there. The ruling is in favor of Brown. Segregation is illegal. The courts say get rid of segregation. What is the South going to do with that?
Ignore it or
Done. All right, so the South ignores this, basically. The South is going to respond, so you'd put here, Southern reaction. The Southern reaction, Harry Byrd, the senator of Virginia here, he is going to go down as one of our great racists at the time. And he says, a day of catastrophe, Black Monday, something like Pearl Harbor. And he proceeds to equate the Brown v. Board decision to Pearl Harbor. And they're going to resist it as much as they can. The Supreme Court's going to tell them that they have to do it. And then eventually by 1958, Byrd and then the Governor Stanley of Virginia, they're basically going to just shut down the schools. They're going to shut down the schools in favor, instead of integrate the schools. They would rather have no schools than integrated schools. This resistance is called massive resistance. That's the name of the organization, the program that they use. So capital M, capital R, this is like a proper noun. It's not just a descriptive phrase. It's a capital noun, proper noun. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead in time slightly. All right, Emmett Till. Let's make this a new number. This should be I think.
Yeah.
All right, so Emmett Till. All right, are you familiar with Emmett Till, the story of Emmett Till?
I think I've heard it before, but I wouldn't be able to say it.
Okay. All right, so Emmett Till is the boy in the picture here. He is 12 years old at the time of this story. And he is lynched and murdered August 28th of 1955 in the town called Money, Mississippi. Emmett Till is a 12-year-old boy, and he's from Chicago, Illinois. He's from Chicago, Illinois. This matters because Chicago is not a segregated city. So he has grown up in a non-segregated city, which means that his body language is not the body language of someone with that psychological damage. He doesn't avert his eyes when a white person looks at him. He doesn't step aside when a white person walks by him. He doesn't act like a segregated kid. He acts like a normal kid. This matters a lot because he's visiting family in Mississippi. Now he's from Chicago, but he has family in Mississippi, so he's visiting family over the summer. And while he's visiting his family over the summer, the white community sees this kid walking around and they don't like it. They don't like it that he's walking around like he owns the place, like he has the right to just walk wherever he wants to walk. The girl in the picture, she's like 18 at this time. The girl in the picture claims one day that when Emmett Till was leaving a store, that he whistled at her, and she felt like he was threatening her, and that he was going to like attack her and rape her. She tells her husband, and her husband's cousin, these two guys in the picture here, Milam and Bryant, they go to Emmett Till's aunt's house. They take him from the house. They take him to their barn. They torture him, murder him, and then tie him to a big piece of like a fan blade. They tie him to a big fan blade and dump him in the river. He's missing for about 4 days. They finally find his body in the river, dead, beaten, tortured. His body's transported up to Chicago. He's a 12-year-old boy. His body's transported up to Chicago. In a normal Christian burial, the normal Christian thing to do is to have the body on display when it's an open casket funeral, right? You go to the funeral, you see the body, you can see that the person is dead, you can, say goodbye to them. But the tradition is that if the body has been mangled or maimed in some way, that the body, you don't display the body, right? If the body is killed in any way that would be disrespectful to the person, then you don't show the body. So in a normal situation, Emmett Till's body would never be shown. His mother demands that his body be open casket. She demands that they show her son because she says, everyone needs to see what they did to my boy. She demands that this be open, and reporters take pictures of his body and publish the pictures across the country. It's published in African-American newspapers and newspapers and magazines across the country, and it's published in African-American newspapers and magazines across the country, and the African-American community across the country is infuriated, right? Especially Chicago, right? Chicago is home to a particularly large population of African-Americans and a relatively wealthy population of African-Americans. They're particularly upset. This gets even worse. When Milam and Bryant are put on trial, they have an all-white jury who acquits them in one day, even though there are 5 witnesses who say that they did it. All of the witnesses are Black. These guys are found not guilty, and they are allowed to go on their way. And the African-American community around the country is enraged by this. Eventually, Carolyn Bryant, right here, the picture, eventually she died just about 4 years ago. And while she was dying on her deathbed, she admitted to making it up. That Emmett Till had never whistled at her. She made it up because she just didn't like him. But she was afraid that she would not get into heaven if she didn't come clean. So on her deathbed, she came clean. So Emmett Till matters. His death matters because his death is a polarizing event. This is an event that is going to activate the African-American community, and it's going to activate them. It's going to get them into action. And I'm going to show you how this works in just a moment. Okay. All right, big number J. Big number J, Montgomery, Alabama. Now let's make sure we understand our timelines here, okay? This is March of 55 Till was murdered in August of 55. Okay, so this is a slightly before. A girl named Claudette Colvin, and she's 15 when this happens. A girl named Claudette Colvin, she decides to not move on the bus. She does not get up from her seat in the bus, and she's trying to challenge the segregation on the bus. She gets arrested in an attempt to kind of start a movement, what she's trying to do. She gets ignored by the community. Why do they ignore her? Why do you think they ignore her? It's because she's a teenager. She's a teenager, right? So the news smears her. They basically paint her as just a teenage troublemaker. As a teenage troublemaker, and it's getting worse when she's also found out to be pregnant, because not only is she a teenage troublemaker, but she's also a slut, right? Like she basically gets, shamed. She basically gets shamed, and nothing happens. Okay, a couple months later, Ariella Browder, a 40-year-old woman, does the same thing, but she later recants because the KKK threatens her life. Emmett Till dies in between this, right? And then we're going to get two other teenage girls that are going to try to do the same thing in October. Okay, Susie McDonald, Mary Louise Smith. In October, they both try to do the same thing. Okay. This is going to lead us into, I think you know who's coming, right? Who's coming? We're talking about bus boycotts.
Rosa Parks.
There we go. Okay. My girl Rosa is right here. Now, Eric, what do you know about the Rosa Parks story?
Basically just that she was on the bus and didn't refuse to move from her seat. That's about it.
Okay. When I learned the story, I learned that she was like a little old lady who was tired and just didn't want to move one day, and the bus driver like overreacted. And then people were just upset that this nice little lady was taken. Have you heard a similar story to that?
Yeah.
Similar version of the story? All right. I would like to disabuse you of that myth. Okay. First of all, that's a myth. All right. Rosa Parks knew what she was doing. Rosa Parks planned it. Okay. Rosa Parks was an active member of the movement. She worked for the NAACP for 10 years. She had participated in the movement, but then had stopped after she had kids and stuff. But she had been an active participant in the movement for 10 years. Emmett Till's murder reactivates Parks. Parks is motivated to do this, right? And so she sees Emmett Till's murder, and she also sees these teenage girls putting themselves at risk. And Parks says, we need to do something about this. So Parks organizes all these people here. Raymond Parks is her husband. Virginia and Clifford Durr are two white people who are part of the movements, right? Edie Nixon is leading the NAACP offices of Alabama. Fred Gray is one of the organizers, right? She gets all of these people together, and an unknown preacher from Georgia by the name of Martin Luther King, who at this point is just a young preacher, but I hear good things about him, right? And they get all these people together, and she decides we need to do this. The bus boycott is what we need to force the desegregation of the buses. Now, it can't be a teenager. Who does it have to be?
Adults.
It has to be an adult. All right. Is it better to be a man or a woman?
Probably a man.
Why? Why would you say man?
Actually, well, people are probably gonna, not sure.
Is the public going to be more sympathetic to a woman or to a man?
At first I thought man, but Probably woman.
Woman, right? They come to the conclusion that the bus boycott will only work if it's a grown woman.
Mhm.
Has to be a grown woman in good standing, right? That a man, it won't be as sympathetic. And also, a man runs the risk of being murdered, right? The men are at a much, much higher risk of being lynched and murdered, and a woman is much less likely to be murdered. Okay? It has to be Rosa Parks. Okay? She is not an old lady. She's like in her late 30s. She's in her late 30s. She's not old. Okay? And she's not just random. This is by choice. She spends a month casing out the buses, right? She spends a month timing out the buses and figuring this out. She finds that the worst, most racist driver she can find is a man named James Blake, right? And she watches all of these drivers over weeks, watching these, taking different routes and different drivers, and she finds that James Blake is the most racist driver. He is the driver that is the most likely to overreact, the most likely to get violent, and the most likely to call the cops. And she says, that's my man. And she says, she also agrees it has to be Friday. Why Friday?
That's when it's busiest.
No, it's not when it's busiest. It's Friday because if she's arrested on Friday night, she won't see a judge until Monday. It gives them 2 whole days to organize, right? It has to be a Friday. So she knows that James Blake drives the 6:30 bus every Friday. She knows that this is coming. And she also knows that in order for this to work, the bus has to be full. So she arranges for a bunch of African American people on the previous stops to get on in an additional number, right? She just needs to make sure that an additional like 7 people get on, and they do, right? And then she gets on and she takes the very front spot, in the African American section. She knows that there's going to be white people coming on the next stop. And the white people come on the next stop, they will move the seat back, right? There's like a little sign that says colored on it. And then when the white people come in, they pick up the sign, and then the black people in that row have to get up and move back, and then they move the sign back. She knows that that will happen at the next stop, right? She plans this 100%. And when James Blake tries to move her, she says, no, sir, I'm not going to. I'm tired. I'm tired, and I'm not going to move. In elementary schools, this makes her seem like an old lady who's tired, physically tired, but she's not. She's mentally and spiritually tired of segregation. James Blake starts yelling at her and being racist and calling her racist names and things. And he tells her that she has to move or he's going to call the cops. And she says, you, sir, do what you need to do, sir, but I'm not going to move. The cops, he goes out, he calls the cops come onto the bus, and the cops tell her, we're going to have to arrest you if you don't move. And she says, I understand that, sir, and if that's what you think you need to do, then that's what you need to do. Right? They arrest her, and she takes what I think is the greatest arrest picture in American history. Because look at the look on her face, Eric. Look at this. This is not a random old lady that just happened to be tired. This is a lady who has laid the trap, and they walked right into her. Right? She knows what she's doing. She's got the slight smirk, the slightly raised eyebrow, right? Just enough to let you know that she knows what's going on, but not enough to get herself in more trouble.
Right.
She knows. And this is when her friend, Joanne Robinson, jumps in, right? Edie Nixon, the head of the NAACP, comes to represent her. And Joanne Robinson, a professor at Alabama State, she has printed off this pamphlet just calling African Americans, calling Black people, if you can afford to stay out of school for one day, if you have another way to go except for the bus, you can afford to stay out of town for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk, but please don't ride the bus on Monday. They organized this protest where all of the African Americans of Montgomery, Alabama are going to stop riding the bus. And Joanne Robinson publishes this off on Saturday and then distributes it in all the Black churches on Sunday. Right? That's why it had to be Friday.
Right.
And so the entire African American community of Montgomery, Alabama goes on strike. And they don't ride the bus. And they constitute 3/4 of the customers. How long can the bus run with no customers?
Not very long.
Right? It's going to lose all of its money.
Mhm.
This works so masterfully. It works so well. It's so disruptive that a one-day protest becomes a 381-day protest. Okay, 42,000 people participate in this. Okay, at this point in time, Rosa gets released from prison and stuff, right? Ralph Abernathy is going to be the one leading the movement. He's a preacher, and he's the leader of the Alabama movement, and he's backed up by that young preacher in Georgia. Man, he's really making waves. He's going places, right? And these preachers are they're going to form the Montgomery Improvement Association. They're going to keep this going. It goes for more than a year, and Alabama starts losing all of its money. Montgomery, Alabama blows through its entire budget, and the entire city is going to go bankrupt by December of next year before they finally integrate the bus. This is our first example of a massive, of a large-scale organization of nonviolent protest that forces change. This is our first example, and these two events, the Brown versus the Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott, are the traditional kicking off of the civil rights movement. Okay, we're going to continue with some other organizations, some other stuff that's going to come up, right? We got quite a bit more coming, but those are the first big ones. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to leave you there. I'm going to stop the recording.